So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Lon to introduce the next panel and panelists. I think you'll have a great time with this one. Again, this is about the current context for investments, situating the work within regulatory policy and investor action frameworks and pledges. So Lon, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. And it's my privilege here to introduce Chris from Lombardier and then Kristen from Sirius. I think that you all read both of their bio, and then I would look forward to a great discussion between two of them. One probably provides some industry perspectives and on the market force and then consumer demand for climate solutions and how Lombardier is investing with the conviction for the solution providers and largely kind of leverage on Chris's background, not only in the practitioner world, but also at OECD on the policy stance. And then he can certainly share a lot of the regulatory development as well as the market force and the consumer demand. And Kristen, Sirius is a phenomenal organization. And I'm sure that many of you have already read the case studies by Sirius, and with a lot of the investor activities and actions that we take have meaningful impact towards investment industry. So without further ado, welcome Kristen and Chris.
So, well, it's wonderful to see you all again, and thanks so much for having us back today. We already started this conversation some time ago, and I thought it might be useful just to give you a little bit of an update on our view and our framework for sustainable investing, just to set the context a little bit for the discussion that will come later, and walk you through some of these powerful forces and what's happened since we last had the opportunity to speak together. So perhaps if we could go to the next slide, we can just start by reminding about our approach. You know, if we very macro approach to understand sustainable investing and ESG, and it starts at the level of the economy as a whole. And we have this framework, which we call the transition from wild to click. It's an economic assessment. And we think that our prevailing economic model is wild. It's wasteful, it's idle, it's lopsided and dirty. This is what we say when people ask us, okay, you are building up capabilities and a team, you have a team of 20 people focused on sustainable investing, and you're trying to mainstream sustainable investing across all of your assets and asset classes. What do you mean by sustainability? Well, we mean that our prevailing economy is wild and it's become unsustainable. And there are these two self-destructive issues with it, if you like. The first one has to do with climate change and the failure to put a price on carbon and all of the damage, the climate damage that we're sadly observing already today around the world. And the second major issue, which people aren't really talking about as much as climate change, but we think are going to be talking about a lot in the future, is the ignorance of natural capital, nature, biodiversity loss, the fundamental underpinnings for our economic model, which are really in decline. So this is sort of the consequence, if you like, at a higher level of this wild economy. If you go to the next slide, that can become quite depressing quite quickly. And there's been plenty of discussion about this, and you just need to open the news to see what's happening in the wild economy, what the consequences are. The good news is that we're convinced that, and this is an empirical conviction, it's an investment conviction, that this is changing. The economy is in the midst of a major transition. It's in the first inning. Maybe not even all the way through the first inning of this transition, but it's an enormous one. And it's towards this economy that we call the click economy, which is the opposite of the wild economy. It stands for circular, lean, inclusive, and clean. And we think that it's being driven towards this better, more sustainable version of an economy globally because of four powerful forces. And we can have a look at those on the next slide, because we thought that it might be useful as a framing device for the discussion today. So what are these four forces, and why do we think that the economy is transitioning? This is what we talk about. This is what we spend most of our time studying. We think that all of them are highly relevant for investment dynamics, for risk and return. Of course, policy and regulation is at the front of everybody's mind at the moment. I mean, just today, there was an executive order in the US from the White House with industry behind it that by 2030, half of cars would be zero carbon. And actually, the US is pretty late to the game on that regulatory development. You know, there are bans on the internal combustion engine all over Europe and in many cities. You know, that has already occurred, or they're being phased out. It's the same for coal and other types of polluting electricity. The price of carbon is on the march. In the EU, we're close to $80. That's almost a doubling in the price of carbon. So the compliance costs of a climate polluting economy and a damaging economy are increasing. And we're seeing a lot of government support in the recovery from this coronavirus crisis. The EU Green Deal is putting 500 billion euros behind a green transition, a transition to a net zero economy. And that includes things like border carbon adjustments. So with countries that are not putting a price on carbon, there are now proposals to tax goods, to put a tax on goods to equalize and level the playing field with jurisdictions that are putting a price on carbon. So there's no doubt that policy is on the march. If you go to the next slide, you can see this interesting statistic here. If we had been having this conversation 1 year ago, about 20% of the world's GDP would have been covered by a net zero goal. In other words, a government saying we are going to achieve net zero emissions at the sovereign level by 2050. But in the last year, we've seen this enormous acceleration, and now 80% of world GDP is covered by a net zero goal, which includes the US, it includes China and Japan. And now the focus is on those remainder countries, the Indias, Brazils, Russias of this world that have not yet set that. But in any case, a target is great. Anybody can have a goal or a target. Of course, what really matters is the policy and the regulation that comes behind a governmental ambition. And that's what we're starting to see march across the global economy. And on the next slide, you can see that it's not just governments, but it's also companies. Of course, this really picked up in 2016 when the US made the decision to leave the Paris Agreement. We saw a lot of companies come forward and say, okay, fine, but we're still in the Paris Agreement as a company because we think it's good for business, it's good for attracting talent, it will make more money in the future, and so on. It's the right thing to do. So we've seen this exponential increase in companies also setting net zero goals, so-called science-based targets. But again, it's a goal, right? Many people can set a goal. It's not hard to set a goal. What really matters is what comes behind. It's the action, it's the implementation behind the goal, which we're starting to see. And at the end of this year, we're going to see a major climate change conference in Glasgow, COP26, where again, the focus will be on governments increasing their ambition, companies, investors increasing their ambition in this so-called race to net zero. And so I think that's actually driving quite a bit of this momentum. But what may be driving it even more is on the next slide, which is what we really get excited about. I mean, policy can come and it can go, right? We understand that. In this case, we think it's here to stay. But still, another administration can change the rules of the game and so on. But what really cannot be retroactively changed is the progress that technology makes. It's innovation, it's engineers being smart, it's the costs just coming down, constantly coming down in these power curves. You see these learning rates in all of these important technologies for the click economy, from offshore wind, which is now close to competitiveness with, or even out competing fossil energy. I didn't even solar or onshore wind on here because they passed that competitiveness years ago. They're all the cheapest source of electricity on the planet is now solar in some countries. And you're seeing it in other sort of frontier technologies that are very important. Alternative proteins, that same very aggressive a downward sloping cost curve and upwards exponentially, trending production curve. And it's simple, sort of kind of boring economics, microeconomics. More production, more scale, the costs come down, leads to greater adoption, leads to more governmental support, or governments moving the bar higher, right? So this is what we've seen in the electricity industry and in the automotive industry. As things happen in the real economy faster than people expect, consumers, on the next slide, start to really buy the thing that becomes cheaper. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see, that what we're already on the climate transition slide, which is fine. So maybe we can just go back to the four powerful forces slide. And I just want to say a word about consumers, because as the costs come down of these technologies, and as policy and bans and influences happen from the regulatory side, we see consumers really start to just go for the cleaner, healthier, more circular option. And of course, that drives the powerful forces again. And then the last piece of the puzzle, or possibly the first piece of the puzzle, are investors. And are they redeploying capital? Well, we really do think that they are. Investors are redeploying capital. We are redeploying capital. And we're doing it because we see this feedback loop of forces churning away. And we're going to hear a lot about that from our colleague at Ceres here. So let me just end with refreshing you on what our own approach to investing in the climate transition does. Climate transition investment universe. So how do we approach this from an investment perspective? Well, our strategy looks to go and find investment opportunities across the entire economy, to really go for the entire opportunity set. So this is our approach to investing in climate transition. So clearly there are solution providers. Here are some examples of companies in our investment universe, not necessarily in the portfolio, but solution providers are key here, right? This is the clean tech universe, all of those companies benefiting from selling technologies that are creating solutions to the click economy, take us away from the wild economy. That's a huge growth area, and it's an important bucket for us to invest in. Then we also, on the right-hand side, we have adaptation opportunities. And adaptation opportunities are really the focus of a lot of people's mind at the moment. It's our hedge bucket, if you like, because even if we are not successful in decarbonizing the economy, if we're not successful in decarbonizing the economy, we're going to have a lot of climate damage. But even today, we're having climate damage, and it's going to get worse. And these are companies that are helping to improve the resilience of businesses, of society, of governments, to detect and monitor and manage climate-related risk. So that's another bucket. And then in the middle, we have the key transitioning candidates. And this is where our strategy innovates, perhaps more so than some others. It's we actually go and look at those higher carbon companies, but the ones that are on the right transition pathway, the ones that are decarbonizing, and we think are going to gain market share and are having large climate related impact. So we don't shy away from cement and steel companies and long distance transportation, because that's where a lot of this transition, most of the transition needs to happen. So we look to identify the companies that are really credibly transitioning, that have set goals that are credible and that are making progress towards them, because we think that that's good for climate change outcome, but it's also very good from a business perspective. These are companies that will gain market share and they will prosper in the future. And that's it for me, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the state and trends of what's going on out there, what we're paying attention to. I'm very happy to turn it back over to Lan now and take any questions or have a discussion after. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And then I think at this moment, we'd like to have Kristen to talk about the activities that she leads. In particular, she leads the Ceres Investor Network. There's a lot of investor initiatives. So let's go with Kristen.
Right. And just thank you so much, Christopher. Your overview really reflects what we're hearing from other members of our network. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ceres, we're a nonprofit organization primarily funded by foundations and individual giving. We have 3 networks. We have an investor network, of which your funds are members. We have a company network, a small group of companies who are working on deep sustainability initiatives. And we have a policy network, which is companies and investors who are engaged with policymakers, really focused on the changes that are necessary to create a more sustainable and just world. So I'm going to talk to you today about investor climate action plans. And really, this is building on the landscape that Christopher named for you, that we are seeing that the real economy is in process of decarbonizing. And the questions for us are whether the real economy is going to decarbonize fast enough, whether we're going to be able to really shift the direction of global warming, and what it is our investments are going to face as we move into that lower carbon economy. So the speed matters, the trajectory of temperature matters, but we recognize that everything in the portfolio will be affected. So the work that I've been doing with the Investor Agenda, which is a global coalition of investor partners. Ceres is the North American partner, but we're with an Asian group, a European group, an Australian group, UNEP FI, and the Principles for Responsible Investing, UNPRI. So those groups and the Carbon Disclosure Project. So 7 groups came together to begin to address the challenges of climate risk and the opportunities of investing in the lower carbon economy together. We've come up with a framework that we believe reflects where investors are going, and we're presenting it to investors around the world at this point. These investor climate action plans are designed to address 4 categories of activity: the investment activity, the corporate engagement, how it is investors engage with the companies in their portfolios, the policy advocacy piece, how they engage with policymakers at a global, national, and even subnational level, and then investor disclosures. These pieces fit together, and that's what you see in this diagram. If investors act on all 4, the portfolio will begin to decline, and we believe the investors will begin to address the systemic risk of climate change. It used to be that when I started at Ceres, I would talk to investors about material risk, and we'd look at a few sectors, we'd talk about risk in specific companies, but I think today we're in a very different conversation. We recognize that climate is systemic. It's going to affect every industry, it's going to affect every asset class, and the only way to address that risk is by engaging in a comprehensive way collectively. It's not something one investor can do alone. So the idea of climate action plans is that they begin to help the investors move together at the right speed and in the same direction. So the expectations ladder acknowledges that investors are at different points in this journey. And I know from working with your leaders that you have done many of these pieces already. You may not have called them your climate action plan, but you have already worked on your governance structures. You've worked on your proxy voting guidelines. You have made specific investments really focused on those climate opportunities, on the transition opportunities that Christopher named for you. So this ladder is designed to help you assess where you are in terms of progress and what more it is you can do with the other investors around the globe. So this is not the full ladder, but just to give you a sampling of the kinds of activities we're hearing about and highlighting in climate action plans. Some investors begin by investing a small part of their portfolio in 2-degree aligned products. So we're seeing that especially in passive assets. We're beginning to see on the high end, some who are really focused on a 1.5-degree trajectory, and they're looking for products and companies. As Christopher said, there are best in class companies, investment opportunities that are really driving in this direction. On the corporate engagement side, Generally, our members are starting by amending their proxy voting guidelines, but then many are moving to the level of filing and co-filing specific climate resolutions designed to move those heaviest emitting companies in a way that will begin to address the climate change challenges. Policy advocacy, we offer to our members every season a set of letters that you can sign on to, articulating the investor perspective on why a price on carbon, why methane regulation, why good disclosure around climate from companies is important at the SEC. So signing on to joint letters is definitely a piece that every investor can take on. But then we also have investors engaging with their own industry associations and working with government affairs departments to begin to really mobilize policymakers to align with the investment opportunity. I was with a global group this morning that was talking about this policy messaging as we go into the conference and the parties, this big global treaty negotiation on climate. And they were saying, you know, it used to be that it was investors calling on policymakers to do the right thing. The messaging is now changed. Investors are saying to policymakers, join us. We are doing the right thing. We are moving our money in the right direction. It's time for you policymakers to support our work. Investors have become the heroes in this story because it is, of course, the power of your capital that will make real changes in the economy. Just a couple other sample areas. Disclosure, I think, is critical. We have for a long time been demanding of companies that they disclose climate risk in really robust ways. We want to see it in the financial disclosures, not buried in a marketing report or something that's a sustainability report that no analyst can find. We've been saying use the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD framework. That's a framework that was developed that really helps us see what are the financial implications of climate change. I think now the focus is turned on investors themselves. We want our asset managers and our asset owners together to use that same disclosure framework for our own publicly available outcomes. It is again designed to help enhance the collaboration, recognizing that no investor can do this work alone. And finally, governance. And I've got to say that coming to you today is exactly what we hope will happen in every fund, that at the top level of the asset owners and at the managers, there will be these hard discussions about what are your practices that will help support the movement towards a lower carbon economy. So just by virtue of having us here, you've done the right thing in terms of governance. We recognize that it's not an area that many boards and directors have as deep expertise, but the willingness to engage, to oversee these programs, to get educated about the science, and to really make decisions about these risks as central to the risk management and investment opportunity of the fund is the key. So this ladder that's shared on the screens is, as I said, just a snapshot, but we can put the link in for the broader document. There's a lot of guidance out there, and we stand ready to help you navigate. There are many different initiatives, but your team has already gone a long way in terms of finding the right strategies for your fund, and we're happy to help support that work. So I'm happy to take questions, or Christopher and I can chat with one another. There's so much overlap in our work.
Well, your presentations are very complementary to the first part of our discussion, because like in our breakout group, we talked about, you know, it's fine to take the moral ground against climate change, and the idea of divesting is fine. And we learned about what the process was and the techniques to be used, inside, outside, all very helpful. But of course, we sit on bodies that have to have a fiduciary responsibility to create a return. Mm-hmm. So you've sort of filled in the blanks. I mean, one of the people in our breakout group made the point that the companies that are contributing to climate change are really an investment risk. Mm-hmm. So But then the next question is, well, what do we do with those assets we're switching? And the two of you did a nice job of laying that out for us. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I would say just, to comment on that point, we get a lot of members who start from a position of we've just got to get these dirty assets out of our portfolios. And I guess most of the largest asset owners and managers who I work with say, well, actually, I can't divest away from this problem. That if I get them out of my portfolio, everything else that I own is still at risk from climate change. So, whether it's the healthcare sector or the insurance sector, all of those sectors will be impacted by climate change. And so actually, while divestment can give you some leverage with those companies, it is really important that you engage with them, that you work with the policy frameworks, because the companies live within that you push on their disclosures. All of those kind of wraparound strategies support the real kind of change that's going to address the risk.
Kristen, one of the things you said to us in reading your materials and working with you over the last couple of years is that you advocate meeting the investor where they are in terms of the steps. And when Lon Minotti and I were thinking about this, we wanted to also make this fairly practical and usable and digestible and not intimidating.
Right.
It's one thing to say that we've done a lot of things in the collective organizations, but what are the kind of the practical steps that investors like us, we've got a almost $4 billion pension plan and a $1 billion endowment, normally take in terms of moving things forward from a governance perspective?
Yeah. So we built the ICAP's expectations around these four key areas: the investment strategy, the engagement strategy, the policy strategy, and the disclosure strategy. So I would suggest that most of our investors sort of create those four buckets, and then they ask what's the next thing for us in each one of those buckets. In terms of the investment piece, we're often seeing things like what Christopher recommended, which is take a look at where there are transition opportunities. So look for the investments that'll help transition, begin to look at climate solutions and make some investments in those areas. And we see them across every asset class. So you may see, green real estate, you might see green bonds. You can take a look at some of the ESG passive indexes if you have those holdings. I know that your fund has significant private equity, and there are real opportunities there to look for those investment opportunities. On the engagement side, as I said, take a look at your proxy voting policies and then begin to ask, well, how can I now use those policies to advance our engagement activities? Most of our investors are not saying we're going to engage with everything we own, choosing one or two sectors where you think with others you can make a real difference. So that seems to be a next step there. In the disclosure, I would say most of our investors have done some level of disclosure, reporting annual reports or other sort of pieces on the sustainability programs. And some investors are dedicating now a special section on climate. Others are doing integrated reports where they're showing both what they're doing on a broad range of ESG issues and a focus on climate. So those are important pieces. Yeah, and I think I've talked a little bit about the policy ladder. There are different levels of activity there. I would say, much of the media that I'm hearing about investor action is focused on net zero commitments. And that's an important piece but it's not a starting place. And in my network, I'm seeing a real mix. Some who start by making net zero commitments and then figure it out after they've made the commitment, what are we going to do next? And others that are really moving the other way, starting with a whole set of actions that make sense for the fund, and then saying we're moving towards a net zero commitment as we get our arms around what's in the portfolio and how we can make progress.
Dave, I have a question both to Kristen and Chris. On disclosure of companies for their progress in this trip, this voyage, are you hopeful that the SEC and Gary Gensler will be more demanding in terms of disclosure than we've had in the last decade?
We are very excited about the rulemaking that's underway now. I think many of our members issued responses to the rulemaking comment period. We're expecting to see the draft rule in October, and our internal conversations with Gensler and other members of the commission suggest that we're going to see significant change. Whether it'll go far enough, I can't tell. Yeah, we're watching it very closely and are hopeful.
Thank you.
Oh, I think that's a really interesting question. It's not just the SEC. I would also suggest that the CFTC is a significant player here. And I had the privilege of actually sitting alongside the commissioner of the CFTC, who has produced an extraordinary report on climate-related risk and how it could affect financial markets. It really is an epic report, very, very good. I recommend it to you. And we discussed it together for some of our investors in a session a while back. And what I took away from that was basically very consistent with what you've just heard from Kirsten, and our approach and the way European regulators are looking at this, and central banks more generally are looking at this. And it's the fact that climate change is core to fiduciary responsibility because it can manifest in financial markets through the risk and the return side of the equation. And it comes in the form of physical risk, actual damage from climate physical events to property, plants, and equipment, as we've seen, frighteningly so, just over the last weeks here. And there are companies now that have basically gone bankrupt because of climate-related risk or liability and litigation-related risk, which is linked to physical risk. And we've seen different forms of lawsuits make their way through various stages. And as we know, it just takes precedent before an avalanche of lawsuits can come crashing down on actors that may be held liable and accountable for the damage that they have caused in the past, or for having misled investors or other issues. And then the final aspect is transition risk. From our perspective, it's very clear, and I hope you could take that away from my presentation, that the economy is in transition. This is happening. It's happening now. It isn't happening as fast as it needs to in order to reach a 1.5 degree outcome, but it's happening plenty fast enough to create and destroy value across pretty much every sector of the economy. And so that really does focus attention on, do investors have the right information in public markets and in private markets to assess where that risk is contained, and is it priced? And if it isn't, when might it be priced? Where is it hidden? And what might be the impacts of that repricing when it does occur? And we've started to see some repricing already, mostly on the growth solution provider side.
Mm-hmm.
Here's Matthew Illian, and Director of Responsible Investing at UCC. We hear of companies making net zero commitments. Can you talk a little bit more about what does it mean for an asset owner or a portfolio to make a net zero commitment?
Yeah, so we have we're working through a global coalition, the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative. And you have been participating in our working group, so you've been there, but I'm happy to share it with the group. Many of our members are thinking about how to make a commitment to net zero. made real by the climate action plan. I mean, I think there's a danger that we see commitments that aren't backed by action, that aren't implemented or implementable. So it's important that net zero by 2050, that's a long-term target. We've got to set really clear internal and intermediate targets. So 2030, even 2025, we're beginning to see targets. Most of the investors are setting those interim targets. They make the net zero commitment, then they take some time and do the hard work of analyzing the portfolio and trying to figure out how an interim target really makes sense across the portfolio. So those interim targets, I would just caution, do take some time. It's not a small undertaking. But once we've got those targets in place, then it's a matter of aligning the investment strategy, the engagement strategy, the policy work, so that you can really achieve them. And I think we're learning more and more. This is a rapidly changing space. The data is getting better and better because of the push on disclosure. And we're seeing lots of commitments. I think now we're looking forward to seeing the real interim targets and knowing how that progress is going to be made real.
Christopher, I think this is a question for you. A couple of us could probably take it, but somebody's friend asked whether they thought that shorting wild companies was a viable investment strategy. You operate in the public markets, and I don't know if you do too much shorting, but maybe just talk about maybe talk a little bit more about the risks for companies who are not moving to the new economy.
Then I'll call.
Sure. So I'll just say a few words, and then I think other people have lots of views on this topic too. But it made me chuckle. But honestly, no, it's a very serious issue, right? Of course, if you look at it from the perspective of an investor and the economy in transformation, there will be winners and losers. And shorting, we can have a discussion about what is shorting's role in a liquid market, providing price discovery, regulating, actors that may be misbehaving, and so on. But the reality is that absolutely value is going to be destroyed by this transition. We've seen it happen already, and it's going to happen in a probably nonlinear fashion, because I don't believe that there are all that many investors or regulators these days who think that this transition will be a gradual, orderly transition. That doesn't really, we don't see much evidence from history that transitions are orderly. They're usually disorderly, and they are nonlinear. And there are often Minsky moments in markets, right? It's that moment where all of a sudden there's a crystallization of the new state of affairs, and that can lead to dramatic repricings when it occurs. So there are strategies that are going long, click, short, wild. We have a strategy that does that in our alternatives business, but it also depends a lot on timing.
Awesome. I think we're in a little bit of rapid fire, Lana. I think you're going the same place that I was. We're just going to reference John's question. Can you talk about which international economies or markets set a standard of best practice for either net zero investment or infrastructure? And then Connie had a question.
Right.
Christopher, do you want to take that? Which markets?
I think, sure. I would refer you to the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is this network of central banks and regulators. It's now close to 90, including the Fed, joined recently. And they've done a lot of work on trying to set standards for best practice in both risk management of the net zero transition, net zero investing, and also green investment. So I think from the scope of the question, that's a good place to go. And then the next one is, we're not seeing enough companies setting all scope targets. That's a really good question. It's essential that companies and investors, I have to say, disclose their supply chain emissions, because that's where a lot of the carbon risk is buried in certain sectors in particular. I mean, if you're in the oil and gas sector or in the automotive sector, and you're going out there and just doing something and disclosing about scope 1 and 2, you can just say, I can tell you right now, that's nonsense. It won't tell you anything. Most of their emissions and most of the risk is in scope 3.
I do want to just make one final comment, especially on the emerging markets question. Which places do we think about this? We have to be very careful, and I'm sure you're all thinking about how we in the global north don't want to be telling the global south that they should change. Really, it is critically important that we invest in developing economies, and those are places where, frankly, there is incredible investment opportunity. The sustainable investments in those places will make a difference, and they'll be good for the portfolios. I think as we think about a more just, equitable, and sustainable planet, we really do have to think about all of the ways in which we invest, not only to address temperature rise, but also to impact those communities and countries and people who most need these solutions and are most impacted by climate change.
I think that early on, Rick has a question regarding Clean Trillion. Is this a still active program with Sirius and UN? And if so, in what kind of status, Kirsten?
You know, we're not using the term anymore, although the principle is still definitely part of our thinking. So Clean Trillion was the idea that that was the number of investments we needed to help move the economy. I think you heard in Christopher's presentation, there's incredible opportunity in the solutions to climate change. There's incredible opportunity in transition investments, and that's now more the way we talk about it. But the principle is definitely there. Many of our members are setting targets. They're saying we're going to invest X billion or X percentage of the portfolio in solutions as part of their climate action plan.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I think that there is a request for either one of you to explain what is a scope 1, 2, and 3 emission. Particularly, Christopher mentioned that a lot of it is in scope 3.
Sure. Should I take that, Kirsten?
Go right ahead. I'm sure we have the same definition.
These are just technical terms for where do emissions occur in the business and life cycle of a given company. So for an oil and gas company, scope 1 emissions refer to the emissions that come from the buildings that Exxon's headquarters and the cars that are driven around by employees. Scope 2 refers to the emissions that come from the power that is used in the refineries and in the offshore platforms and so on. So that those two, scope 1 and 2, are emissions that are encapsulated in the business itself, its business practice, and how it goes about doing its business. Scope 3 is its supply chain. So it is basically, for Exxon, it would be the people who are burning the oil and gas. And the emissions caused by the burning of the oil and gas, the products of the company, that would be calculated in the scope 3 emissions. And of course, that's relevant from a financial perspective, because if there are higher carbon prices, or if the demand for oil has the rug pulled out from under it by electric vehicles and renewable energy, that will affect the supply chain. That will affect the supply. The carbon pricing will affect the demand for the product. So you need to look at the full picture, the emissions from a company itself and from its upstream supply chain, the materials that are used that go into the construction of whatever its product is, and the downstream usage of the products themselves.
Just one more quick question on something that is on my mind. In terms of the transition to electric vehicles, what is the use of energy and pollution from the generation of electricity versus internal combustion engines? Is it a 10-to-1 or 2-to-1, or what is the relationship?
I'm not an expert on the actual numbers, but certainly I know when investors are counting the emissions, they are looking both at the energy used to power the electric vehicle. They're looking at the energy used to manufacture the electric vehicle, and then scope 3, the energy that's burned when the vehicle is driven. But Christopher, maybe you know more about that sector and the ratios.
I would, that's the correct answer, certainly. I would just add the temporal dimension to that, which is really important here, because it is true that today, the manufacture of batteries, for instance, can use minerals that come from places that are problematic, cobalt and so on. It's carbon intensive to manufacture batteries in the cars themselves. The steel, the aluminum in the car, that's all carbon intensive. And the grid itself that is used to charge the batteries might have a lot of coal in it, right? But that is at a point in time today. And we're very, as I said, I think we're just in the first inning here. And, electric vehicle sales are going through the roof right now. We're talking about gigafactories from Tesla. All of the innovation and all of that is ahead of us. We're talking about, 50% of vehicle sales being electric in the next 10 years, up from something like 2% today. So what we've seen just in the last 2 years is a huge amount of innovation in the circular economy around electric vehicles, and companies like Tesla are leading in this to find ways to capture batteries, to bring them back, to recycle them, to reuse the materials there, to extend their life in other industries. And then, of course, the grid itself is in the process of transitioning and decarbonizing. So, oftentimes, investors need to think about the fact that a transition occurs over a period of time. Technology and innovation is ahead of us. But yes, there are legitimate issues today. And as investors, we need to focus attention on them and help companies through stewardship move in the right direction.
Yeah. And this is one of those areas where the policy climate is changing rapidly. So here in California, we already have restrictions on both passenger vehicles and light and heavy duty vehicles in terms of their emissions. So that policy change will drive the EV acceleration, and now 7 other states, I think, are following California. So even before we get national regulation on the transportation sector, we're seeing it at a state level.
Kirsten, you're right. You have a lot of trustees and board members, on the call. There's a bunch of staff who probably are wondering about implementation and what investments we should make. But I'm just curious if you can point the group to resources in the governance area. I mean, you mentioned that the trustees are taking an important first step, but how best to move forward from a governance perspective? I mean, does it pertain to risk really, or asset allocation, or objective setting, or oversight, or all the above?
I guess unfortunately, maybe my answer is all of the above. But I think we're seeing as practices, in those 4 buckets, the investment practice, the engagement, the disclosure, and the policy work, recognizing that all of those fit into your fiduciary duty at the trustee level. And so instructing your staff, your teams, to really look hard at their area of work and develop plans that are moving towards alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, towards a science-based target of a 1.5 degree future. That's the right direction at a board level to give. I think in terms of reporting back, we're going from saying, what's your target, to saying, what's your plan? And so that would be, I think, in many cases, what the board should be asking of staff is, show us your plan, show us where it is you're going to be making progress in terms of moving the investments and addressing this systemic risk. I would just say, in terms of resources, the other thing that has become really a shift in my work is that investors are not acting alone. They're working in coalitions. So we really are seeing these global coalitions become more supportive of individual investors. So, Ceres partners with the ICCR, with the Intentional Endowments Network, with lots of the faith-based investors, both on the pension side and on the endowment side. coming together and saying, what can we do collectively? I think that's also something that the trustees should be looking for, is partnerships that will enhance your work.
One of the items that, if you haven't, Lon alluded to it, one of the items that we will send your way are the case studies of the 10 investors who have been making concrete plans over time in each of these areas. One of the things that struck me is everybody's a little bit different, right? But the other thing is that Westpath, the United Methodist Church, is included as one of those. I have to be honest, Lon and I were talking earlier, we all aspire to be one of those test cases, but that's a good way to dig into what other investors are doing, and we can make sure you have access to that case study.
Yeah, we also have some Paris-aligned investment case studies. I'll ask my colleague Natalie to pop those into the chat as well.
Lon, we have a couple of minutes here. We probably want to build in a little bit of a break. Are there any kind of final questions that people would have of Chris and Kirsten?
Hi, it's Bob. Great presentation, Kristen and Chris. One thing I heard about recently was the environmental impact of server farms. And that was something that I had never thought of before. And there's been some conjecture about the environmental cost of our emailing activity, and maybe more so obviously during the COVID epidemic, where everybody thinks that their carbon footprint has been substantially reduced by no commuting and no other travel. Appreciate your thoughts on that.
So we're seeing net zero commitments from some of the big tech companies, so from Google and Facebook, and one of the ways that they're taking action is they're making commitments to 100% renewable energy. So that move, as they begin to address their own carbon footprint, specifically through those server farms or the data centers, making a commitment to renewable energy is critical. I just worked with a group of those companies on a just transition paper, where we were really focused on not only the commitment to renewable energy, but making sure that the jobs that are created in those renewable energy facilities are quality jobs, and that they're accessible to communities that have traditionally been left behind. So I know that the power of procurement, in the case of the server farms, they have the power to change the way that clean energy gets developed because they're buying so much of it.
I'd say that's exactly right. That's the answer to that question, and also to the Bitcoin question, by the way, which has been coming up quite a bit too. Will Bitcoin boil the oceans is an article headline I saw not too long ago. And the answer to this is there are two parts to this answer. One is anything that involves electricity is its carbon intensiveness will be a direct function of how carbon intensive is the grid. Where it draws the electricity from, and as we've established, the grid is in transition because clean energy, sustainable energy is just becoming the cheaper, better source of electricity. It's going to take time. So yes, it is, and actually we do look at these companies to make sure that, some less carbon intensive, smaller tech company, it might actually be heavily investing in 5G and satellite and cloud. And so it might be carbonizing quickly, might not be a problem for it today, but it might become a problem in the future. So it is important to focus attention on that. But the other point, which, I often just have to force myself to be reminded of, is that the big ticket items when it comes to climate change are deforestation, coal, cement, steel, long distance transportation, glass, agriculture, utilities, power generation. It goes basically in that order. And we need to be, we ought not to take our eye off the ball of ending deforestation, which is just there's no excuse for it really. And also focusing attention on coal and those other harder to abate industries.
Well, this is very illuminating discussions between two of you and then among all the audience. And thank you, Kristen, for sharing with us from your seat, seeing the governance as asset owners, and also kind of from investor point of view, how to advocate for policy changes, and then also advocate for investor various disclosures. I think that those are the really effective ways to bring us forward. And then Christopher for sharing with us all the industry movements, regulatory fronts. And then I think it's just a lot of topics that we can continue for the whole day. But this will help us maybe to think about goal settings, and certainly to improve our thinking and the framework in terms of governance and the plans that we will later introduce to help us getting there. So thank you, Kirsten and Chris. And thank you all of your participation. We will have more great discussions to come.
Please join us in thanking both Kirsten and Chris.